Well, hi, and welcome to part 3 of Where Are the Lost Tribes of Israel? This is Dr. Michael Bogart with Aspect Ministries. In the previous 2 parts of this series, we saw that the answer to the mystery of these lost tribes of Israel led us from their former territories in what's now northern Israel, southern Lebanon, and western Jordan toward lands in the north and east. The deported Israelites were scattered in the area where Syria, Turkey, and Iraq now come together. Some were also settled to the east in northern Iran. And from there, some of them probably moved even further east. Why? Because east was where the action was in those times. The trade route that would become known as the Silk Road was beginning to link China and India with western lands. Central Asia was a rough and ready sort of place in those days, but still more or less wide open and available for settlement. Moving east would put the Assyrians, who had deported the Israelites, far, far away from them and render them incapable of further harassment. Within 100 years, the Babylonians would replace the Assyrians as the major superpower of the day. And then a century after that, the rising culture of the Medes and Persians would bring down the Babylonian Empire. Now, maybe some of the scattered Israelites did spend some time in Media and Persia, but my guess is that many of them moved on rather quickly into Central Asia. One tiny piece of evidence for this idea comes from references in Persian literature that indicate that the king decreed that a large group of migrants within his territory needed to move out of Persia towards the east. Also, there's some indication from the Bible itself that might point to Israel moving out of Persia by the 530s BC. Now, I mentioned in a previous video that beginning in 606 BC, nearly 120 years after the Assyrians deported the Israelites, the Babylonians did a similar deportation of the southern kingdom, the Jews, the Yehudi, or Judeans. Only the Jews were treated slightly better. There they were allowed to maintain their culture and identity when they were exiled to Babylon. Then when Persia conquered Babylon in 536 BC, the Emperor Cyrus the Great allowed the Judeans, if they so desired, to return to their homeland around Jerusalem. Many did return, and there are lists of returning Jews in both the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. But here's my point. No Israelites from the northern tribes are listed in the records of those returning from exile. Why aren't Israelites mentioned? Maybe because they weren't under Persian jurisdiction at the time. Maybe they had already migrated out of Persia. We saw that there was a very ancient tradition of people claiming Israelite descent in Uzbekistan around Bukhara and Samarkand. In fact, the name Samarkand very possibly means city of the Sumerians. Kand means city, and Samaria was the capital of Israel, often used for the nation as a whole. Samaria city? Okay. I should point out that the Israelite people of Samaria are not the same as the very ancient Sumerians, the first recorded civilization of maybe 3,000 to 4,000 years before this time. They're also not the same as the later Samaritans of the Old and New Testaments. These later Samaritan people were also a product of the Assyrian policy of relocation, only in reverse. People that the Assyrians had conquered in other parts of their empire were also deported from their lands, and these people were moved into the area that had been the Kingdom of Israel. They were settled around its former capital, Samaria, and had intermarried with the few Israelite survivors remaining in the land. The mixture of Israelites and other displaced peoples became the Samaritans of the later Old and New Testament books. The Good Samaritan. And by the way, I should mention that there is a tiny remnant of Samaritans even today, less than 1,000, living in Israel. And they certainly represent people who are at least partly descended from the lost northern tribes. But what about other people groups who might be descended from these lost tribes? Here are some possibilities. First, the B'nai Israel in Uzbekistan. As I mentioned in a previous video, there have been people identifying as Israelites, not Jews, living in Uzbekistan for many centuries. Travelers and neighboring people call everyone in the area who practiced Judaism Bukharan Jews. But some of those classified as Bukharan Jews would not claim to be Jews at all, but B'nai Israel, sons of Israel. These B'nai Israel people specifically claim ancestry from the tribes of Naphtali and Issachar. Some scholars assert that Jews in significant numbers only settled in Central Asia in the 6th century AD. But there are indications that Israelites may have been there much longer than that, since there are Hebrew and Aramaic inscriptions from the 300s AD in the region, and possibly there are some even earlier than that. Some anthropologists even admit that people associated with ancient Israel are one of the oldest ethnicities in Central Asia. So this seems to be a slam dunk for me. Elements of the lost tribes in Central Asia. Now let's move south to Afghanistan and Pakistan. Would Israelites have gone that way? Well, let's take another look at the Silk Road map. Notice that there is a route branching off the main east-west Silk Road in Central Asia, leading south toward the Indian Ocean. What would prevent a large group of people from moving down that southern route and perhaps finding a place to stop and settle somewhere along the way? They may have intended to move right to the coast on the Indian Ocean. But remember, during that time, there were powerful Indian kingdoms that might have prevented such a move. So, what if large groups of Israelite descendants stopped in what is now Afghanistan and Pakistan? Sounds kind of far-fetched, doesn't it? Maybe like something out of a historical fiction novel. But is there any evidence of people in that area who have traces of Israelite connections? Well, as a matter of fact, there may be such evidence among a large group of people called the Pathans or Pashtuns. These people converted to Islam many centuries ago, but among their legends and oral histories may be clues of connections to several of the Israelite tribes in Pathan clan names. For example, Ephriti may be the tribe of Ephraim, Gadun the tribe of Gad, Rabbani, Reuben, Levani, Levi, Musahel may be the people of Moses. Those arguing against any Pathan connection with ancient Israel would point out that the Pathan language, Pashto, is unrelated to Hebrew. But anthropological studies seem to indicate that in the distant past, at least, the Pathans or Pashtuns may not have been a single ethnic group, but were a conglomeration of various groups of people who all settled in the same region and over centuries ended up speaking a single language. Even today, the Pathans are a very large and diverse group of people who fiercely maintain their tribal and regional differences. Yes, they are united under the veneer of Islam. But some of these tribes seem to have a more ancient code of law and morality called Pakhtunwali, which has somewhat of a resemblance to some of the principles of the Old Testament law of Moses. Here are a couple of other intriguing hints. The Pathans rock back and forth when reciting the Quran. It's not a very common practice among Muslims in general, but it's a very common practice among Jews as they pray and recite the Torah. And Pathans themselves claim descent from a remote ancestor called Afghan. No surprise, since many of them live in Afghanistan. But they maintain that Afghan was a descendant of King Saul of Israel. Though no one named Afghan is mentioned as a descendant of Saul in the biblical record, on the other hand, at least two of King Saul's sons were known by more than one name in the Bible. So Afghan could be an alternate or second name of one of the sons or grandsons of Saul. So it could be that among these Muslim Pathans there are remnants of some of the lost tribes of Israel. Some Pathans openly claim such ancestry, which is amazing given their ardent Islam. Okay, that's enough for now. Are there other people who might be descended from Israel's lost tribes? Quite possibly. To find out, please continue to the next video, Where Are the Lost Tribes of Israel? Part 4. For now, this is Dr. Michael Bogart of Aspect Ministries. We'll see you then.